Thomas Wilson stared at the bank foreclosure notice as snowflakes gathered on the empty restaurant windows. After 12 years of success, Wilson's bistro would be gone in 3 days. When a desperate knock came at the door, he found a thin man and shivering child seeking shelter from the storm. The scarred hands of the homeless father revealed a past Thomas never expected to discover. The mysterious stranger's masterful cooking transformed the failing bistro's final days into an unexpected sensation. Thomas Wilson stared at the quiet dining room of his once bustling restaurant. The tables that used to be filled with laughter and conversation now sat empty, covered in a thin layer of dust. Outside, snowflakes gathered on the windows, creating a peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the turmoil in his heart. After 12 years of pouring his soul into Wilson's bistro, everything would be gone in just 3 days. The economic collapse had been swift and merciless. First came the canceled reservations, then the staff layoffs, and finally the mounting pile of unpaid bills. Now, all that remained were the memories and a final notice from the bank. The property would be repossessed on Friday morning. Thomas had spent the afternoon boxing up personal items and small kitchen equipment he could salvage. Most of the high-end appliances would stay behind, collateral for debts he could never hope to repay. As the evening grew darker and colder, Thomas began his final closing routine. He dimmed the lights and moved toward the door when a sharp knock startled him. Through the frosted glass, he could make out 2 silhouettes, one tall and thin, the other small and hunched. Standing on the snowy sidewalk was a man who appeared to be in his mid-30s. His face was gaunt but dignified, with several days of stubble covering his jawline. Beside him stood a small girl, no more than 8 years old, wrapped in a coat far too thin for the biting winter weather. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, and she clutched a worn backpack against her chest. The man introduced himself as Eric and his daughter as Sophie. They had been walking for hours trying to find shelter for the night. The city's homeless facilities were all at capacity due to the storm, and Sophie's asthma was worsening in the harsh weather. Thomas hesitated briefly, but as Sophie coughed painfully, his concerns seemed suddenly insignificant. With a quiet nod, Thomas gestured them inside. The warmth of the restaurant enveloped them as he led the pair to the staff break room in the back, which contained a small sofa, microwave, and a tiny bathroom. As Eric helped Sophie settle onto the sofa, Thomas noticed the man's hands. They were covered in a pattern of small burns and scars, the unmistakable marks of someone who had spent years working in professional kitchens. Thomas recognized them immediately because his own hands bore similar evidence of his culinary past. When Thomas asked about the scars, Eric grew quiet. He eventually admitted that he had worked in restaurants before, but seemed reluctant to elaborate further. Instead, he focused on making Sophie comfortable, removing her wet shoes and wrapping her in a blanket Thomas had provided. The next morning, Thomas awoke to an unexpected aroma wafting through the restaurant. Following the scent of cooking food, he made his way to the kitchen. There, he found Eric working confidently at the stove, moving with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned chef. Breakfast waited on 2 plates, simple but perfectly executed eggs with herbs, and the last of the bread Thomas had been saving, transformed into golden toast. Sophie sat at a small table nearby, drawing elaborate pictures of plated dishes with colored pencils. The illustrations showed remarkable detail and understanding of food presentation for someone so young. When Thomas mentioned he needed to clear out the perishable inventory before the bank arrived in 2 days, Eric offered to help create a final dinner service. Thomas was skeptical, but with nothing to lose, he agreed. That evening, using only what remained in the kitchen, Eric prepared dishes unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. He combined flavors and techniques that transformed ordinary ingredients into extraordinary creations. The remaining portions of chicken were transformed with spices into a dish that filled the restaurant with an intoxicating aroma. Thomas put a simple sign in the window indicating a special final service. To his surprise, a few curious customers wandered in. Their expressions changed from sympathy to astonishment as they tasted Eric's creations. One guest, a local food writer Thomas recognized, immediately began taking photos and typing frantically on her phone. As the impromptu service wound down, Eric finally shared his story. He had once been the executive chef at Fusion, a celebrated restaurant in San Francisco known for innovative cuisine. His career had been on a meteoric rise until Sophie was diagnosed with severe respiratory issues requiring specialized treatment. The medical bills quickly overwhelmed him, even with insurance. The stress and financial pressure eventually led to a breakdown that caused Eric to walk away from his career. By the time Sophie's condition improved, they had lost their apartment, savings, and everything else. Thomas went to bed that night with his mind racing. The bank would still come on Friday, but for the first time in months, he felt a spark of something that might have been hope. The next morning, Thomas was awakened by knocking on the restaurant's front door. Expecting bank representatives arriving early, he was shocked to find a line forming outside. Word had spread overnight about the mysterious chef creating masterpieces in a closing bistro. The food writer's social media posts had gone viral among local foodies. Seeing an unexpected opportunity, Thomas rushed to speak with Eric. Together, they formulated a plan. They would run the restaurant together for one final week. With almost no ingredients left and no money to purchase more, they would rely on donations from local markets and create a daily menu based entirely on whatever came in. Thomas called several vendor contacts explaining the concept. Local producers began contributing their excess products. Vegetables that were too oddly shaped for supermarkets, dairy approaching its sell-by date, and cuts of meat that would otherwise go unsold. The last chance kitchen concept became an overnight sensation. Customers lined up to pay premium prices for the innovative dishes, while knowing their money helped a homeless father and daughter. By the fourth day, the restaurant had generated enough revenue to make a partial payment to the bank, which grudgingly granted a 2-week extension. On day 6, a well-dressed woman dined alone at the corner table. After her meal, she introduced herself as Elena Vasquez, a restaurateur from a neighboring city who owned a small restaurant group. Elena was so impressed that she offered a partnership deal. She would clear Thomas's debts if he and Eric would bring their concept to her restaurant group. The surprise menu approach, using reclaimed ingredients, would become their signature, addressing both economic and environmental concerns while delivering a unique dining experience. 6 months later, Thomas and Eric stood in their newly renovated kitchen. The restaurant had been renamed Second Chances and had a waiting list extending 2 months. Sophie, now enrolled in school and receiving proper medical care through the company's insurance, spent afternoons helping design a children's menu featuring colorful, nutritious dishes inspired by her drawings. The staff had grown to include several people who had also faced housing insecurity, creating a kitchen team that valued their work with a passion born of personal experience. What began as a desperate act of kindness during the darkest period of Thomas's life had transformed into something neither man could have imagined. The failed restaurant that had seemed like the end of Thomas's dream had become the beginning of something far more meaningful. A chance encounter on a snowy night had given 2 strangers exactly what they needed most. For Thomas, a renewed purpose and innovative direction. For Eric and Sophie, the home and future they had lost along the way. As Thomas watched Sophie showing a new server her latest food drawings, he reflected on how close he had come to turning away that knock on the door. Sometimes, he realized, our greatest opportunities arrive disguised as problems we don't think we can solve. And what about you? What unexpected knock on your door might be disguised as your next great opportunity?